Hi, everybody. This is Saad. Just returned from my first trip post-COVID. It turns out that one can have somewhat of personal agency, even though our overlords tell us what time to go to bed and what time to take showers. Today, I have a fantastic guest. I have Janice Fiamengo on the show. I'll introduce you in a second, but hi, Janice. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show, Gad.
Oh, I'm so happy to see you again. Janice is a repeat guest, one of the rare repeat guests. I think the last time that she was on was in 2016, and I'll be asking her whether things have gotten better or worse since our last chat. She is a professor, a retired professor of English at the University of Ottawa, about 2 hours away from Montreal. She hosts a show titled the Fiamengo Files, which was hosted by Studio Brule. They received a permanent ban from YouTube. Maybe we'll talk about that. So you can still find them, but not under YouTube. She is the author of Sons of Feminism, Men Have Their Say. This was a 2018 book. And then an earlier book in 2008, The Woman's Page, and many other edited books. So welcome again. Oh, by the way, before I cede the floor to you, if you appreciate these kinds of chats, guys, there are many ways that you could support this work. Most immediately, you can just go below the channel. There is an icon with a thanks. You can press that, and then you can exhibit your generosity. All right, Janice. So there are many things to talk about today. I thought the first thing, if you don't mind, you recently retired. I know of other professors who are roughly our age who are contemplating this possibility. If you don't mind, tell us about your retirement. Are you happy that you've retired from academia? Do you regret it? Give us a general feel of where you are in your life.
Oh, well, I was very happy to retire. I'm much more interested in writing on my own, writing about issues that interest me, and starting up again a YouTube channel. I found the academic environment quite stifling, the extent of the woke project everywhere, especially in the humanities and social sciences, but now, of course, invading even the natural sciences and engineering, etc. The extent of it is so much so that I don't think most people can feel comfortable there. It's sad to see the extent to which the entire university enterprise has been corrupted. So I was glad to get out of there. I hasten to say that there are still good people there, but that overall it is impossible really to avoid social justice activism as an academic. So I was pretty glad to leave, although I knew many good people in my department and elsewhere.
I mean, I guess of course the woke stuff, or what I would call in the parasitic mind idea pathogens, are certainly a fundamental problem in universities, and what causes many of us to rethink the fact that we should spend our time in academia. But independently of the idea pathogens, I think there's a second problem in academia, which some of it may be related to the wokeness, but some of it is problematic independently of the idea pathogens, and that is just the velocity of at which things move in academia, or lack thereof, right? So if you are an irreverent thinker, a bold thinker, a courageous thinker, academia is not built on promoting or rewarding or incentivizing such people. Now, that some of that is due to the political correctness and all the other woke stuff, but independently of that, I've known of people in the natural sciences who decided to leave academia and head off and start independent research institutes because they thought that they can get their research done much more quickly and with a lot less bureaucratic tape and so on,
Yeah.
and that occurred independently of all the woke stuff that you and I fight against. Well, what are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Absolutely. The bureaucratization of the university has been another huge problem, and just the professionalization of the profession, if that makes any
Yeah.
sense, in that, there was a time, and in fact, I experienced it, I think, in the early days when I was an undergraduate student at the University of British Columbia, which was from 1982 to 1986, when at least some departments in various faculties were still made up of individualists, nonconformists, independent thinkers, outliers, dissidents, dissident intellectuals, all of that. That was still possible then. And I think that was a residue of the 1960s, perhaps. There were a lot of strange people, brilliant nonconformists teaching in academia. And that was part of the joy of going there, was that one had access to these brilliant and strange minds, many of whom one felt would not have fit anywhere else in society. They weren't equipped to lead. They weren't equipped for the corporate world, the business world, and that was precisely why they were valuable. And all of those people have been forced out in various ways, partly through the woke project, partly through, claims of harassment, or that they created unsafe environments because they refused to conform to speech codes and various types of ideological correctness, but also just through the professionalization of the disciplines. They weren't necessarily interested in publishing their research in the particular ways that were approved by the institution. They weren't interested in attending the types of conferences that were considered appropriate. And so, all of those people are gone, and the level of conformity of all sorts, not only ideological, as you say, but in every other way as well, has really deadened the search for knowledge in the academy, and that's really too bad.
And it seems, if I'm thinking about all the different disciplines where, the idea pathogens have most proliferated, there's quite a few who can claim the mantle as, the most parasitized departments. Probably schools of education might be the worst. But I think your home department, I don't mean specifically at University of Ottawa, but English literature would probably where some of the most, lobotomized, parasitized people would be working, correct?
Yes, I would say, outside of the studies departments, which sprang up, of course, and mostly in the late 1970s and proliferated in the 1980s, the women's studies, the gender studies, the race studies, critical legal studies, anything that's called studies tended to be quite bad fat studies. But yes, English adopted all of those ideological perspectives with extreme enthusiasm. And there were very few. One of the reasons I went to the University of Ottawa was that its English department had held out for a long time as maintaining a historical focus, so that it was interested in literary periods, it was interested in the development of literary genres. It of course had to take on board the various ideological approaches, but it maintained some kind of objective interest in literature, as an object of study. But even no department can hold out forever, because the pressure to conform, for the reasons we just discussed, are so great. That certainly English religious studies, I think, sociology, anthropology. There's a whole bunch of departments that, as you say, could claim top spot as most woke, but literature is right up there.
So I think there are several reasons that might explain why some disciplines are more parasitized than others. And let me propose a few. And I think that this itself, what I'm about to talk about, would make for an interesting scientific project or academic paper. So I'm housed at the business school. And so I think the business school and the engineering school are inherently the least likely to be parasitized, because there is a mechanism by which your ideas are going to be tested in the real world. So there's an immediate feedback loop to your bullshit. So you can't really develop mathematical models of consumer choice rooted in postmodernist mathematics, because those models are not going to predict anything. Or you can't develop, you can't build a bridge as a civil engineer using postmodernist physics, because the bridge is going to collapse. And so, notwithstanding the fact that I've been warning people for many years that don't worry, the idea pathogens are coming for you in chemistry and physics, as they now have.
Oh, as they have, definitely.
But there
Yes.
are some fields that inherently, epistemologically, are going to be more protected. I think what happens in the studies fields, where activism is really more important than the seeking of truth, and where you're not protected or you're not inoculated by a strong adherence to the scientific method, that's where the idea of parasitic, the parasitic garbage can infiltrate itself. So, and that's going to kind of lead me to segue to the next topic. Literature, the study of literature to me need not be something that is not studied scientifically. And as a matter of fact, I told you before we came on that I would ask you this, notwithstanding the fact that you're not an expert on this. There is a field within my general area of interest, evolutionary theory, where you study literature via an evolutionary lens. It's called literary Darwinism. And the gentleman who really is the pioneer of this field, I just pulled up his name. His name is Joseph Carroll. So just a few for the listeners who might be interested. He's written a book called Literary Darwinism, another one called Evolution and Literary Theory, a third one called Reading Human Nature, and then I'm just going to show you a few books. I think you'd get a kick out of the title of this book, Madame Bovary's Ovaries. So there you go. Then here you've got The Literary Animal. It's an edited book by David Sloan Wilson and Jonathan Gushel. And then here, not quite literature, but certainly within the art world, The Art Instinct. Each of these books are making the argument that nothing is outside the purview of our evolutionary thinking, right? We are intoxicated by literary narratives because ultimately they are great windows to our human nature, right? So the things that we study, the sexual longing, the parent-child conflict, the paternity uncertainty, those themes reoccur whether it's an ancient Greek tragedy or it's Jane Austen or it's today. And so, well, first, I guess, had you heard of the field of literary Darwinism? And if not, would you like to weigh in on it or say anything about it?
I don't know very much about it. I certainly had heard of it, but I don't know enough to weigh in, with any kind of credibility. But I would say, yeah, I mean, that's you make a very good point. If one comes at the study of literature or indeed anything with an interest in understanding human nature or even a belief that there is such a thing as human nature, which has already been pretty much dismantled by our postmodernist friends. And I think that there, I don't know if it was inevitable that English literature would be colonized in the way it has been by social justice ideology. It could have maintained its not really scientific but serious academic credentials merely as a record of the culture. And I say merely, but I mean that's enough on its own. If going to university is understood as part of the project by which the younger generation has the culture passed down to it. If that's understood as the primary project of especially taking an arts or humanities degree, then there's no reason why not simply reading the great books and coming to understand them, understanding the social and other contexts out of which writers wrote, and the particular literary techniques that were meaningful at the time that they wrote, and the various ways of reading that literature. That is enough. It's all of the race, gender, class, sexuality kinds of angles that recent critics have brought to bear on literature. Those are not necessary at all to make that study relevant and fascinating, but partly because the postmodern project or the political project of social justice, it isn't interested in the culture. It sees it as irredeemable. It sees it as destructive and horrific. Yeah. And so it wants to destroy it and dismantle it, rather than see it as a repository of enduring truths about humanity and how human beings have understood their lives and made meaning. So I agree with you that that would be a fascinating. I'm sure it is a fascinating approach, but it depends on the notion that there's something human that's worth knowing about, rather than passing on ideas about revolution and the hideousness of the civilization that our forefathers created.
Well, and I mean, I guess if you the traditional lenses, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that where you do literary criticism. So if you're a feminist, then every literary work is deconstructed as a struggle between men and women. The patriarchy is trying to do bad thing. If you're a Marxist, then that same literary, book that you're trying to analyze is viewed through the prism of class struggle. If you're a postmodernist, then anything goes because there is no objective truth. So rather than doing a genuine, honest attempt to try to understand the meaning that is conveyed through these books, it just becomes sort of an orgiastic quest to solidify your victimology narrative, correct? I mean,
sure, absolutely. That's all it is.
Yeah.
You take the particular political lens, everything is read through that lens. The particular text that you're studying either exemplifies, heteropatriarchal tyranny and all of its manifestations, or it resists heteropatriarchal tyranny, and therefore it is to be celebrated. So it's either to be condemned or celebrated, and it's to be, dissected solely in terms of how it conforms or resists the particular pattern of dominance that one is analyzing. And it's in a really impoverished and totally predictable way of reading literature. But it satisfies because it confirms and it solidifies the political project of those professors who want to push that ideology.
So do you think that those professors who enter those fields, did they start off with a more, purist bent of, I just love books and I love to read Dostoevsky? No, okay, so just by your laugh.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
I think some did in earlier days when I started school, for example. Although all of those ideologies were present in academia, they were making their way into the study of literature. They weren't dominant at that point. And so you could still be a purist who just loved language and loved stories and, how they mean and the various ways they embody worldviews from different cultures or different time periods. You could start out that way, but then in order to advance in the field, it soon became almost impossible to do anything other than one of the approved ideological approaches. So, but then by now, most students, by the time they even graduate from an undergraduate degree, and certainly by the time they graduate from a master's or a PhD, they have been thoroughly marinated in those ideologies, and those are in many cases the only ones they've been taught.
Unbelievable. So a couple of more questions about literature and writing and so on, and then we'll get into some of the woke stuff. So one of the things that I wish I could improve in my reading history, I have if I may say, an incredible personal library, but almost all my books are nonfiction. Almost everything that I read is nonfiction, and it really stems not from a lack of interest in reading fictional works. Because as I mentioned earlier, I think we can learn a lot about human nature as someone who studies human nature from reading fiction. But given this sort of fixed pie that I have of time, then there's this other nonfiction book that I'd like to read more than... So, number one, how can I get over this weakness in my personal history? And what would be some of the top books that you'd recommend? The top... Here are 5 books, Gad. Next time we speak, I'm hoping to hear that you've read them. Can you give me some?
I'm not one to lecture you about that. Unfortunately, I read very few novels nowadays, even though novel reading was one of my favorite things to do when I was a student.
Why do you?
I just don't have time. Okay. Same thing. I read a lot of online articles. I have a tremendously large email correspondence. I'm trying to keep up with things that are going on in the world. I don't do very well at that, but yeah, I just don't have time. I've started again, though, a little bit, because the new project that I want to work on will involve looking at literary works as keys to how earlier authors, earlier eras understood the relationship between men and women in their society. And so right now I've been just started rereading George Eliot, famous 19th century British author, her work Middlemarch. So that would be one that I would recommend to you. It is a Middlemarch.
Oh, Middlemarch. Okay, thank you.
Middlemarch. It's her great novel. It is a portrait of a small provincial community and a number of individuals trying to live their lives within it. And she has such the narrator, but it's obviously George Eliot. Marianne Evans was her real name. She has such an intimate understanding of the ways we as human beings deceive ourselves about who we are and what we need and what we want in life, and how we deceive others, and how we are carried away by utopian longings or imaginings of who we should be. And the insight into human nature, which is written in both a comic and a tragic manner, is just tremendous. All of her work is great, and that is one I would recommend. I'm a huge Jane Austen fan. I think that Jane Austen touched with the lightest satirical and ironic pathos the difficulties of human beings in being true to themselves and true to their ideals. I think she's wonderful. All of the Russians are fantastic. I would love to do a program of rereading the 19th century Russians, especially Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, for example. The Demons, which is about ideological possession, is a novel that I read partially years ago and really want to reread. These are huge, complex books that could occupy, a year of one's life delving into them and truly understanding them. So I would recommend that. I've also recently reread a wonderful book by Henry James called The Bostonians, which was published in 1886 and is about the feminist movement in Boston as part of the social progressivism that replaced first Puritanism and then transcendentalism in the Massachusetts area. And it is the most, to me anyway, fascinating analysis of the feminist movement. He sets the novel in 1874, and it completely demolishes the idea that the early feminists were reasonable and were merely interested in taking up the mantle of citizenship to share the burdens of citizenship with men, which is what, of course, we've all been told over and over again. And he, of course, it is a novel, so it's his perspective on things. It's not a documentary, but it is a very compelling portrait of the feminist movement and other progressive movements as replacement religions, as distorted ideological manias that grip and deform the human soul. And it's very powerful and fascinating. Wow. So I would recommend that one too. I'd love to talk about that one more.
Wow, those are some great. I've got my work cut out. I did start reading about 20 years ago, Crime and Punishment. I must have gotten through about 100 pages, and I always regretted that I never finished it. So
it's a great one.
Yeah, that certainly is a great one. When the first one that you started with, where you talked about Self-Deception, the George Eliot one. So let me mention an evolutionary analysis of self-deception. So Robert Trivers, who's one of the truly giants of evolutionary biology. Some have argued that he's the biggest biologist since Darwin. That's saying a lot. He was actually supposed to come on my show, and then regrettably, while me trying to be as charitable and kind as I can be and diplomatic, he is someone who has been known to be quite cantankerous and erratic and has had some mental health issues. So our attempt to communicate to get him on the show broke down, which was a real regrettable thing because I would have loved to have him on. He's about now maybe in his late 70s. But Trivers, in any case, no one can doubt his scientific output, wrote a paper, and he's also written a book on the evolution of self-deception. Why? What would be the evolutionary reason that we are so good at engaging in self-deception? Do you want me? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you want me to cede you the floor to see if you want to take a crack at what might be an explanation, and then see if it jives? You want to do it, or do you want me to just tell you? It's up to you.
Well, I'd rather you just told me, but I would say certainly that on the most basic level, I suppose self-deception makes it more possible for us to live with ourselves if we give ourselves rationales for why we are not responsible for something that we did, or something that we did that was wrong, or why there are forces that are ranged against us that prevent us from achieving what we think we should be achieving, or why we're really acting out of the best motives when we're really acting out of baser motives. Certainly makes the comfort of life more manageable, rather than a self-awareness of how we have betrayed our own ideals or betrayed others.
Well, so certainly that's a perfectly valid explanation to try to understand the management of self-deception when it's looking inward, right? So all of the examples that you gave are, how do I live within myself? How can I self-deceive? So if I did A, I can live with having done A, or right?
Right.
But his explanation is really rooted in why the fact that I've evolved self-deception is actually a function of how I'm going to interact with you. So it's other oriented. So let me explain, because it might sound cryptic what I'm saying. So in the same way that when you have an evolutionary arms race between a host and a pathogen, and there's an evolutionary arms race as the pathogen is trying to evolve ways to trick your immune system, you evolve ways to try to fight against that. So that's what we mean by an evolutionary arms race. Well, Trivers argued that one of the fundamental features of human interactions is Machiavellianism, right? I'm trying to get you to do something without you recognizing my duplicitous attempt or my manipulative attempt. And so you've evolved the ability to try to read in me certain cues of deception, so that if you read those cues, then you can protect yourself accordingly. Now, one of the best ways I could make sure that I don't emit any cues of manipulation is if I first believe the lie, right? So think about the old adage, right? You first have to believe the lie yourself before you tell it to another, right? So if I can convince myself that what I'm about to tell you is truthful, shutting off any cues of deception, when you come with your keen detecting eye to try to pick up those cues in me, you can't find them because I've already self-deceived myself. What do you think of that?
Well, it's a pretty cynical approach to human nature and human interaction, but I can't say that it's wrong necessarily. Does he have a theory about why some people would be able to avoid that sort of double mechanism of deceiving themselves in order to deceive others? Is there a way in which not deceiving oneself allows one then to engage somehow more profoundly, more productively, perhaps, with others, because you don't have all that layer of self-deception and other deception?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Look, I think it sounds cynical because it makes it seem as though every interaction is laden with this evolutionary dance. But think about something that we're both interested. I mean, anybody's interested in mating behavior, right? I mean, you look at it from anti-feminist perspective. I look at it as an evolutionist. When a guy is trying to convince a woman that he is very interested in her, whereas in reality he may not be so interested in her, but he would love to get an opportunity for a mating situation to happen, he gives her a gift that is laden in many cases with duplicity. So I don't think it's cynical in a sense. I think it's part of human nature. Now, I'm a purist. I don't even like to go to networking functions because from my purist bent, just the fact that I'm going to this function to network, therefore there's an ulterior motive, upsets me because I want every interaction to be as pure as possible. So I don't mean to imply that he's arguing that we're just all these lying bags of garbage that are constantly deceiving each other, but we are often trying to manipulate the other, right? When I'm a salesman and I'm trying to convince you that these jeans really look great on you, or you really should buy this car, I'm not always being my most pure self. And so I think that even for the purest of souls, there is at some point some duplicity taking place. When you tell your child, I think you can be whatever you want to be in life, isn't that in part a form of duplicity? Because I don't think my son is going to be the next Michael Jordan, even though I think he could be most. So I don't know. Does that
Yes.
reduce the cynicism that you thought?
Yeah. Well, and it's true that one does meet people who, in actually a rather positive way, believe their own propaganda or lies, to put it crudely. And I have met such people, and often they do make very good salespeople because they're not stymied by an awareness of the falsity and the manipulation involved, because they do actually believe that they're helping people to make a great purchase. And, and they actually believe that, I guess, that even if they're looking at somebody who doesn't look very good in a pair of jeans, that somehow, I don't know, that they can see that they look pretty good anyway, and it's good to be enthusiastic. And I actually, that's a very interesting thing, because I envy such people in some ways. And I think I'm not very good at that. I'm very self-conscious about, I just often feel very self-conscious in all sorts of different types of interactions where, if I'm trying to convince somebody of anything, even if I'm trying to make an argument for something I absolutely believe to be true, I don't like attempting even the act of persuasion. So, and that, which is strange, but it's true. And I've found that in my own, the videos that I've made and the writing that I do, I realize that I'm actually not trying to convince people who aren't already convinced, which often people will dismiss that and say, what's the point then?
Yeah.
If you're writing to the converted. But that's exactly what I'm doing. I am writing and speaking to those who already have the feeling that something has gone terribly wrong, especially in the realm of how men are portrayed, men's life possibilities, the way in which men are treated in our society generally. I want to speak specifically to men and women who already recognize that. I don't want to try to force them or even to persuade them necessarily. Then that's just part of who I am, because I am self-conscious about projects of persuasion. So it's very interesting.
But that to me, if I don't mean to, open up the psychoanalytic couch here on you, but why is it that you find that the act of persuasion to be a form of impurity? I mean, I look at it actually quite the opposite. I look at it as, I am a deontological purist pursuer of the truth, and if I see someone whom I think is a lost soul when it comes to certain metrics of truth, then I am the apostle who's going to come and hit you with the brick of truth. I see that as a great act of nobility, whereas you see it as somehow an act of, your colonialism. What is it?
No, I don't see it as anything wrong with it. In fact, I admire people who engage in that kind of work of trying to lead people who are in error into truth. It has to do with me, I think, but with a particular. I don't like having to think about what will be most persuasive. I don't know why it is exactly. It would take some kind of deep work on the psychoanalyst couch to figure it out exactly. But it has to do with my own self-consciousness and perhaps lack of certainty. Although I am certain about the things that I speak about publicly, but I just don't feel comfortable attempting to persuade. I feel more comfortable giving the ammunition of what I know to be true to people who themselves
can go
are
out
confident and
yeah
happy in doing that kind of,
yeah
not proselytizing, but proselytizing for the
yeah
truth.
yeah oh I like it. So what I mean what I don't know if there's an exact episodic moment that you could think of where you said, okay, this is a cause that I want to pursue, but what is it in the feminist project, feminist in the negative sense of the word feminist, in the way that we both understand it? Because of course we could both agree that Christine Huff Summers, equity feminism is something that we would both support. Men and women should be treated equally under the law. Most reasonable people would say, yeah, of course. But when we say feminism, we mean it in all its ugly, insane manifestations. What is it that made you say, I'm a woman, so I'm not going to fall prey to tribal identity and say, I'm going to stand with the women, even if I think it's a bunch of bullshit? What allowed you to supersede this and say, I'm standing with the men and I think they deserve dignity? What allowed you to break through the likely tribalism and pursue the correct position? What was it in you?
I guess it was just recognizing that everything that I had been told about what feminism was and what it wanted to achieve was wrong. And that became clear when I saw the vicious and dishonest actions and behavior of various feminists. It was particularly crystallized for on the day that Warren Farrell tried to speak at the University of Toronto in the fall of 2012, and a crowd of angry students mobilized by their professors came to prevent him from speaking. And he was speaking about one of his major passions, which was the title of a book, The Boy Crisis, that he was, I think, writing then, and which was published a number of years later. And so he was talking about the limitations, especially facing boys in their life possibilities because of the way in which the school system, and school system in particular, but everything else in our culture, is designed to encourage and affirm girls and femininity, and is designed to discourage and vilify masculinity. Pathologize, absolutely, demonize, marginalize, everything to do with masculinity. So that's what he was talking about, and he is not an anti-feminist in the positive sense. He's extremely sympathetic towards women and mothers, etc., far more so than I am. And yet they wouldn't even allow him to speak out of a position of the most ridiculous, arrogant ignorance. Not a single one of them, you could tell, had ever read anything Warren Farrell had ever written or understood anything about what he was trying to argue, and yet they were determined that he must not be allowed to speak. That was really the signal moment in which cancel culture fully came into being, I think, at least as far as I understood it, and as a trend on university campuses. So that was really the crystallizing moment when I thought, and I'd been uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable with feminist ideology for years and years, but I'd never really done anything about it publicly. But that was sort of the beginning of my sense of mission to speak against it whenever I could. But I'd become uncomfortable with it far before that, just being in the classroom and looking out, seeing a classroom full of very self-conscious, often quite brash, hectoring young women, full of a sense of their own importance, that every word they said would be applauded, that all they had to do was mention their victim story and people would allow them to speak, and that they would have authority and power. And then looking at the young men in the class and seeing that there was no way, not only were these men not oppressors, they were highly benevolent in their intentions towards the women and the world in general, but that they had been cowed. They didn't have a voice anymore at all. They were supposed to apologize, and they felt that deeply, that they should apologize for their very being. And it sickened me to see that and to think what it must feel like to sit in classrooms, in classroom after classroom, month after month, year after year, listening to how your sex was responsible for all the evil in the world, and that you bore the weight of centuries of oppression and cruelty on your shoulders just because of the way you were born, and that because of that, the only thing you could do to escape the condemnation, the righteous condemnation of that, was to essentially turn over all power to your sisters who were going to bring about some kind of utopia of justice and compassion.
Well, I sense your incredulity, and of course, I share your sentiments of exasperation. Look, I don't know if you've had a chance to fully read my last book. I mentioned this not to plug the book, but because it's going to speak to exactly something that you just mentioned. In one of the chapters, I talk about an anecdote whereby apparently a female fan who was attending my university, who was part of the women's club of the business school or something like that. She said, well, we'd really love to have you and come and speak at one of our events as the keynote speaker, where maybe you can talk about how, you've been a great ally to women in your career. Now, boy, did she, I guess, not understand who I was, because I was very polite, and it was the interaction was quite nice, but I said, well, I'm actually not an ally to women. I'm an ally to every single individual who is worthy of my allyship. My dean is a woman. My associate dean is a woman. My departmental chair is a woman. We have more female chaired professors than we have men. I don't think they need my allyship. It is insulting and infantilizing to presume that they need my protection and my allyship. But I'd be happy to come and talk about the evolutionary reasons for sex differences. Well, Dr. Saad, we'll get back to you. You know what? We're going to go a different direction. So I thought that was so insulting. You already have women in my department that are grossly outnumbering men, but yet here is a man who apparently is worthy of being invited to this thing, where he should only be talking about how he has singularly helped women achieve. It struck me as so grandiose in its narcissism that it was sickening.
Yeah, unbelievable, isn't it? And these are the same feminists who will object to what they call benevolent sexism.
Of course.
If a man dares to hold a door open or offer to take the wheel in a long car trip, or anything that implies that the woman is in any way delicate or in need of his aid, that's a terrible thing. But at the same time, he's supposed to somehow devote his life to advancing women and promoting them and standing up for them, and never say a word about this interests of anyone other than women. Yeah, it's amazing.
But so here's a question for you, and maybe it's a bit out of your wheelhouse from a perspective of the evolutionary point I'm going to make, but certainly as a woman, you can certainly weigh. We are both evolved beings in a Darwinian sense. Most women, if you're going to ask them what are they sexually attracted to, are going to offer an archetype of the man that they're attracted to that is the epitome of what they otherwise go to the women's studies class and refer to as the pathological toxic male. He is brash. He is socially dominant. He is ambitious, right? Now, it's not a guy who is an abuser, right? He is kind to the people to whom he should be kind. So nobody is saying that you're a caveman who's beating and raping everybody, but that the archetype of the male hero is precisely what women fantasize about. And that's why when you do a study on romance novels, so literary Darwinism, you find that it is the exact same male archetype that is captured in every single romance novel that's ever been written. So how does the woman who sits in the women's studies class, doesn't shave her armpit because, patriarchy, but yet in the deep privacy of her home is sexually fantasizing about exactly that guy that she then points to and says, you're a pathological beast? How does she reconcile these two things in her head?
Well, she doesn't reconcile them, and you can see all sorts of articles written by these feminists, confessing their attraction to precisely the kind of man. You can find them all over the internet. Why am I attracted to precisely the kind of man that I know I shouldn't be attracted to according to my feminist principles? And some of them will simply present them as, they'll sort of brag about the contradiction in themselves. they're not able to, and they're never able to take the next step and to say, gee, maybe there's something wrong with the theory that I'm developing, with the theory that I have embraced as my religious rationale for being. Maybe it actually runs counter to human nature. Actually, that's the theme of the novel I was mentioning that I was studying, The Bostonians, just recently. It's precisely that. It's about a young woman who is convinced by a slightly older feminist proponent that she should devote herself to the feminist cause. She's a very articulate platform speaker. And she falls in love with a Southerner, a veteran of the Civil War who fought on the Southern side, who has very retrograde views about women. And she finds herself overwhelmingly attracted to him and his vision of who she really is as a woman. And so, Henry James, the author, he put his finger on precisely that contradiction that
Wow.
he saw in the early feminist movement, and we still see it today. It's a startling thing.
Do you think that, I'm going to ask it regarding the whole feminist thing, but more generally, we can blow it up to all of the woke parasitic ideas. If we compare where we were, say, 5 years ago when you and I last spoke on the show to today, have the idea pathogens continued to proliferate? And if so, how much longer can this go on? Can we hope for it to... I mean, I like to always leave off a lot of these talks when where I say, look, there is still hope, right? Be optimistic. Otherwise, there'd be no point getting out of bed. Do you share that optimism, or is the university project dead and we need to break everything apart and restart from zero?
Well, I certainly would like to see private universities beginning now, because I don't see any reform happening within universities in any time soon. I agree with you that the woke project can't go on forever. Unfortunately, I'm not particularly hopeful about reform taking place in the next few years. I think everything is going to probably have to collapse before it can be changed. I don't know. I mean, it's possible that a new generation will reject the stifling conformity and the reductiveness of all of these, as you say, idea pathogens that have become the dominant orthodoxies of elite culture, not only in universities, but in the political world and the corporate world and elsewhere. It is quite possible that a whole generation just coming up now who have been taught almost nothing else will say, forget it, and will rediscover different ways of looking at various subjects, and we'll find those exciting and bold and revolutionary. I certainly hope so, but right now I don't see that happening. I see us with the entire COVID project. It seems everything, the mass feminization of our society, the development of governments as conforming to the sort of the devouring mother archetype. I've just been writing about that a little bit. Not that I really understand the psychoanalytic theory behind that idea, but just the idea that our governments demand our utter dependence and conformity, as you were saying at the outset, telling us how many people we can have over on Christmas Day and how many windows we should have open, and whether we should wear our masks or not, or whether we should allow an unvaccinated person to attend dinner, and all of those types of things. Our chief health authority here in British Columbia, Bonnie Henry, announced last spring that she was thinking of inaugurating a BC Hug Day.
Nice.
Pardon me?
No, I said nice. I was
nice.
being
Yeah. Can you imagine a hug day, a day that we could finally, at that point, it was about June, 14 months into this pandemic, that we could actually hug our relatives and friends. Thank you so much, Bonnie Henry. But that was only if we were very good. Yeah. And if we followed all her orders and took our medicine. The infantilization of the citizenry and the consolidation of authorities as the stern, wise, all-knowing mother figure, forcing her children, citizens, to comply through persuasion, through manipulation, through punishments. it couldn't have been more evident. And so I feel like all of the problems that we've been talking about, conformity, virtue signaling, the demand that one comply, vicious spiraling accusations that you're a bad person if in any way you don't conform, all of the things that we objected to 5 years ago have now been ramped up even more when the government has decided that it's even going to decide whether you can keep your business open, or whether, if you're a Christian pastor, you can have your church open, while meanwhile, of course, people are crammed into Costco cheek by jowl every hour of the day, but you can't have church for 1 hour on a Sunday. I mean, it's just so, the level of irrationality and the degree to which people have been willing to comply to even the most self-contradictory and ridiculous of mandates and orders. And when I see the people, a young couple with a 3-year-old child, and they're all wearing their masks while they walk outside, or somebody sitting alone in his car wearing his mask. And it just seems to me that we have become a society so ridiculously and irrationally fearful and willing to give up every single freedom for the promise of some kind of security. It seems that the triumph of feeling over reason is complete, and it's pretty dispiriting. I don't see in those people much will to think for themselves, to make their own risk-benefit calculations, to do their own research and make decisions for themselves, often because they're not able to make decisions for themselves. They're not even allowed to anymore. So I think we're in a pretty bad situation right now. But I'm always hoping that I'm wrong. Like, my philosophy is sort of stoic pessimism. I get out of bed in the morning not because I think it's going to be a good day when the tide is turning, but because I like doing my work. I like writing things and thinking. But I always hope to be wrong. I would love to have a conversation with you in a year where you say, well, Janice, you were pretty pessimistic the last time we spoke, and it turned out you were completely wrong, because this movement, arose right the day after we talked, and it overturned everything, and now we're living free lives. I would just love that, and I do hope that that's the case.
But why is that? And not that I disagree, but I just want the viewers to understand. When you started this explanation, you referred to the link between COVID and mass feminization.
Yeah.
Why are all the things that we've been talking about? Why is that mass feminization rather than mass acquiescence to our instinct to follow the overlord, which need not be linked to a feminization mechanism? So can you explain that?
Well, I just think that COVID, that's a long story, but I would say in general, it is a quality of the masculine, not of every man, of course, but it is a quality of the masculine to dissent.
Right.
Men contribute to their society by bringing something that they can do that is of particular worth, and that can, it usually involves some combination of something involving courage or strength or skill or risk taking or boldness or hard work or wisdom or critical thinking, that kind of thing. I mean, that's what men do. Women have a different, I think, some women do that too, of course, but I think that's the masculine in them. But the feminine is the quality that looks for security, that wants to make sure that, so that's what I mean. That what the COVID project has involved has been making it absolutely impossible for dissident men, bold men to take risks. In fact, the whole idea that there was a COVID war going on, but it was the most peculiar war of all, because it was a war in which none of the traditional masculine virtues, like boldness, physical courage, risk-taking, etc., none of those was allowed. Not only were they not wanted, they were ruled out of order altogether. If you were relying on your own risk-benefit calculation, you were seen as murderously indifferent to the welfare of others. If you were willing to take a risk and keep your business open, you were seen as cruel and terminally reckless in your attitudes, and you were demonized as a risk to public health. And so yeah, every masculine virtue that any person might have has been squelched by the COVID project in a way that I think is unprecedented. And there are all sorts of ways that the COVID project lined up with feminist ideology, in the way it celebrated submissiveness, in the way it celebrated only female types of heroines, in the way our leaders came forward as, stern but benevolent mother figures. All of that has been quite startling to me, because I've been thinking so much about the feminist project. So it seemed to me that, yeah, COVID was an occasion in which the feminist project was able to be aligned with this biosecurity state project in ways that have been really damaging to male independence, especially because it has impacted men's ability to look after themselves, to provide for themselves and their families, and to make decisions for themselves and their families based on their own knowledge and understanding.
So in a way, I mean, if I were to summarize this excellent explanation that you just gave us, in a way, what COVID has allowed to do is complete the castration of the Western man project, right? There were still a few men that had the morphological features of testicles. Then COVID came along and said, no, I see you've got male genitalia. Time to cut off those balls. That's basically what you're arguing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you could say that feminism had already
done that,
completed that project, even before COVID. COVID just exacerbated it and confirmed it and made it a reality writ large, and made clear that this is the direction our society is going to go now, unless we somehow turn things around. Because every man, even before COVID, knew that he was dependent on not being accused. He could be in his personal life falsely accused, either of some kind of act of domestic violence, or perhaps sexual abuse of a child, and his personal life could be destroyed. In his professional life, he merely has to be accused of sexual harassment or sexual assault, and his professional life can be destroyed. Of course, not every woman is going to do that, but every woman can, and she must know that she can, and every man knows that he is at some level vulnerable to that kind of accusation. The ramifications of that for dissident masculinity are absolutely, I mean, they're huge. So that was already the case even before the government came along and said, you can only work at our say-so. We can close down your business. And I was struck by the fact that it seemed that those governments that are most feminist compliant have also been the most cavalier about leaving businesses closed for months on end, in the name of some kind of completely fanatical COVID zero project, so that men who had built businesses over years and years had to sit and watch them collapse and die. Like, that's just incredible to me.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Quick question. As you're sort of discussing sort of the injustices that men faced or potentially could face, I thought about, what is the demographic of the typical person who writes to you to thank you for your outreach? And I couldn't quite predict. So there are two possibilities. One would be more men write to you because you have a high profile woman, a former professor, a retired professor who's defending them, or you have also the closeted women who despise the attack on their sons and husbands and grandfathers, who could also be writing to you saying, hey, thank you for defending the safety of my son who's going to go into the workforce. Do you have a sense of which of these two demographics is the one that's most likely to be reaching out to you? I would think the former, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's fairly rare for women to write to me. I mean, I do get, I do hear from women. There are a lot of women out there who are appalled and disgusted by feminism. I wish more women would speak out, because it's a lot easier for a woman to stand up for men than it is for men actually to speak against feminism. They immediately get accused of misogyny and all sorts of horrible things, which it's harder to make that accusation against a woman, although we get lots of nasty stuff as well. But yeah, it's mostly men for sure. Men, a whole variety of age groups. I see myself primarily as, well, no, I was going to say I see myself primarily as speaking to young men, because I think it's particularly hard for them, because this is all they've ever heard in many cases from the very early years of their public schooling, many of them raised by single mothers, many of them lacking any kind of father figure in their lives, any sort of model of positive masculinity. So I kind of see myself primarily speaking to them, but really to any man who has wondered if he's crazy in thinking that, it certainly seems as if men don't matter at all, that they are expected to sacrifice for their society. They're expected to do all of these things for women, and they're judged as whether they're a good man or not, according to whether they put women first. But at the same time, they are marginalized and ignored, if not, as you said, pathologized constantly for the very qualities that feminists demand that they exercise on behalf of women. I mean, it is just utterly
unbelievable.
Crazy.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
I know that recently you and I communicated by email, and you had been weighing in on something that actually happened in Montreal. Speaking in this case of, yes, a really violent form of toxic masculinity, the Montreal massacre that I think happened in 1989, where I can't remember, is it 11 or 12 women were killed by a madman?
Yeah, 14 women were killed by the gunman, as you say, on December the 6th, 1989. And he also injured 10 more women and 4 men. He went into the Polytechnic Institute at the University of Montreal in the afternoon of December 6th, and he separated the men from the women. He announced that he hated feminists. And even when one woman objected that they weren't all feminists, he then opened fire and moved up and down the hallways in search of more victims before finally turning the gun on himself. And yeah, I've always been bothered by, or for a long time anyway, I've been bothered by the way that day was turned into an occasion for a bunch of fear-mongering about the omnipresence of violence against women in Canadian society, and of course the further demonization of masculinity. And so I did a lot of research over the last year about the reporting around that incident and anything I could find out about the gunman's life. He was born Gamil Garbi. He changed his name to Mark and took his mother's maiden name, Lapine. And so I researched as much as I could find out about him as well, and just about the reality of violence against women. And so that was my first video in the reconstituted Fiamengo File 2.0 series that I'm launching now. After after Studio Brûlé was received a permanent ban from YouTube. So yeah, I mean that it continues to fascinate me how that day, 32 years after the event now, has remained this excuse to condemn and shame all men. Every year there is discussion about how men need to unlearn toxic masculinity and how men have to stop consenting to the oppression of women. And every man looking on knows clearly that the only way he can get a pass on that day, but that day is really just a microcosm of the society as a whole, the only way he can get a pass is to recognize that there will never be a day to honor his sex and their particular contributions to society or sacrifices. That, even Remembrance Day, as Mark Lapine himself pointed out, has been equalized. It's no longer about male sacrifice, because that would be sexist. So men looking on know that the only way they can get a pass is by disavowing their own sex by accepting their shameful affiliation with Mark Lepine and by pledging to work unceasingly for women's advancement, even if that's to their own disadvantage through, for example, affirmative action hiring, affirmative action policies at universities, which have been going on for decades and decades. And yeah, it's a startling microcosm of the feminist warping of reality in the service of ideological ends.
Well, I in the Parasitic Mind, I have a quote from our common heroine, Hillary Clinton, who said, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the exact quote. I mean, the real victims of war, when millions of men die in war, is obviously women, because their death is their so even the death of the millions of men did not allow them to get a little grain of victimology score. So even when you are buried, right, you're dead. Yeah. The one who is grieving is the greater victim in this story. So it truly is a form of pathology that hopefully we can extricate ourselves out of, because for a sexually reproducing species, you can't continuously come up with narratives pitting the two sexes against each other, right? I mean, David Buss, who's a fellow evolutionary psychologist and one of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, has made on many occasions the wonderfully powerful point that when it comes to, evolutionary dynamics, there is a lot of competition, but usually it's intrasexual competition, right? Men compete very violently against other men for access to women, and women, using their own strategies of competition, compete quite feverishly intrasexually. There's a lot less. So if you're going to talk about competition and violence and manipulation, there's a lot more intrasexual competition taking place than intersexual. So the project, not only is it grotesquely false on endless epistemological grounds, it's evolutionarily false. Men fight other men a lot more than they, met out violence against women.
Yeah. And so how is it that now, for the last, I would say, at least 150 years, the narrative has become more and more standard, accepted by both men and women, that there is nothing good in the pair bond, that men hate women, that the entire history of the human species has been the history of men oppressing women and being cruel to them, that women are morally superior to men, that men are in fact sort of secondary, failed female beings, and that's the best thing.
Heterosexual, forgive me for interrupting you, heterosexual mating is penetrative, therefore it is inherently violent. Now, you don't need to be a fancy evolutionary psychologist or evolutionary biologist to kind of scratch your head and go, are you insane? So if you're taking a sexually reproducing species and arguing that the act of reproduction is tarred by it being violent, even though it was very loving, even though it was very consensual, it's penetrative, therefore it is inherently violent. Well, how do you think, Madame Lesbian, did you come to be? Was it not through the act of penetrative sex that you came to be? But apparently the irony is lost on them.
Yeah, I know. It's really, I don't know. I mean, I find it just astounding, really. There was something in the Spectator the other day, a couple weeks ago, an article called "The Dangerous Pleasure of Hating Men" by one of their columnists there, a woman named Mary Wakefield. And I thought right away, I just can't imagine a man publishing an article in a mainstream magazine called "The Dangerous Pleasure of Hating Women." I do know a very few men who hate women. I don't know any man who takes pleasure in the hatred. Right. And, and I appreciated the article. I mean, most men I know absolutely love women. But I appreciated the article for naming that phenomenon as pleasurable hatred. We hear a lot of discussion about how women are allegedly afraid of men, and that's the basis of feminism. And we hear some discussion about women being angry at men. but enjoying their hatred. And the point she was making in the article was that she was noting that Netflix recently has produced a whole series. She was talking in particular about some mini series called Made, which I've never seen, about a single mother escaping from an abusive boyfriend. And then every man she encounters is either actively predatory or at least passively sexist. There's not a single man with any redeeming qualities in the whole miniseries. And she was saying that Netflix is really working overtime to turn man-hating into a kind of, recreational sport, that women actively enjoy and sit there with their buttered popcorn and really get into it. And she even confesses that she herself indulged in this sport for a while, and she was abusive to her husband and accused him of mansplaining, and searched back through her life, through all of her experiences, to find instances that might be deemed sexual violence or sexual aggression. But then she got out of it. But and she hopes that the trend will end. But but I just thought, and I did appreciate that she actually names it, because that's the thing. And she that it has become this thing that women bond with one another over, and it's a phenomenon. I mean, I don't know, as a man, you would have to speak to your male friends, I guess, but from what I've heard from men and all the men that I know, it is not a phenomenon that really exists amongst men. Of course, it is culturally forbidden, so even if there were germs of it, it would be, quashed. But I mean, again, to look at it through the lens of evolutionary psychology, I don't know whether there are explanations in evolutionary psychology for the fact that something that it doesn't seem men have, an enjoyment of hating women, is something that is flourishing. Certainly it's encouraged in our culture, but I don't even understand where it comes from. I've heard theories, obviously. Men are born of women. They feed at their mother's breast. They have a period in their early years when their body is inseparable in a way, in their mind, from the mother's body, so that there is a bond with women's bodies there, that what feminists often call objectification of women is really men loving women's bodies so much that they will actually die for them, loving them more than they love their own minds. Whereas women don't have that. They have quite the reverse. They have an in-group preference. They too have a sense of bonding with the mother figure, with other women, and their primary bond is with the child, and the need for the man to provide security in order to protect that child. So it's a very different kind of relationship. And that, I mean, I have one friend who theorized that women's dependency on men for so many centuries was a dependency born of need. And it was a very different kind of emotional, it wasn't an emotional dependency in the same way that man has an emotional dependency on women for various reasons, and that now that women don't have to be dependent on men, that there isn't much left. Like there isn't actually a deep instinctual love. Of course, there isn't among some women, but that overall there's a different kind of response from women towards men. I mean, I just don't know, because I'm getting into areas that are purely speculative. I don't know anything about it really, but what struck me in that Mary Wakefield article about the dangerous pleasure of hating men, she imagined, she talks to her friends, they all say, oh, well, these are very, there's a grain of truth, and they say, yeah, but there were 100 years when men misrepresented women, so this is just payback for all of that. That's the pendulum theory, that men used to hate women and represent them in negative ways. Now women hate men and represent them in negative ways. That isn't even true, though. I mean, like, if you read any novel from the 19th century, there are no novels about men hating women and misrepresenting women.
Most things that men do in their life that bring them purpose and meaning can ultimately be linked to the ultimate desire that that thing which they achieve will get the attention of women, right? So, for example, if you think of rock stars, down to the last one, if you ask them, why did you want to become a rock star? Not a single one says, because it was for the greater love of music. It was because I learned that that's how I can get women. So, you know, Picasso gets a long lineup of women, even though he's a very unattractive in a stereotypical manly sense. He wasn't an attractive, handsome, he wasn't tall, dashing, and so on. But yet he can get tons of gorgeous women to line up so that he can have sex with them because he was Picasso, right? The great writer, the great singer, the great soccer player, the great whatever is doing all these things ultimately because he knows that that's a path towards getting the attention of women. There is nothing that men desire more in terms of a currency than to have a potential access to women. So, by the way, that speaks to really, if you truly understood evolutionary theory, you'd recognize that women have a lot more power than what the feminist project convinces women that they have, because sexual selection, which is one of the fundamental features of Darwinian theory, right? There's natural selection and sexual selection. For most species, sexual selection is carried via female mate choice. So in other words, it is the recurring choices of females choosing the right males that determines the evolutionary trajectory of that species. So what more do you want as a feminist statement than you have that power? So it really is a form of, you know, you talk about, today we say gaslighting. It's epistemological gaslighting. It is the exact opposite. I mean, think about it. Men, their biggest frustration in life is that they present themselves to the world hoping to get access to a worthy woman, but yet women stand on their pedestal and go, no, 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 right? Now, what happens later in life? So when both men and women are 20, women hold all the power. And therefore, men have to learn that they're going to be rejected 100 times until the 101st time someone agrees to go on a date with them. Now, at 50 years old, when women have, just through a thing called life, they've lost some of their mating value because the 20-year-old woman doesn't have the same mate value in a very crass evolutionary currency, right? She doesn't have the same mate value. But the man who's now 50 and now has the currency that women desire, which is he's got high status, then the women at that age bracket will say, this is unfair, this is the patriarchy, this is grotesque, right? These disgusting 50-year-old going for the 24-year-old where we're standing here, it's the patriarch. So, but you didn't care, you weren't upset when you were 20 and you held all the power in the world when you rejected 150 guys and to your point, rejoiced at being able to sit on your pedestal and reject all those guys. You suddenly become boo-hoo-hoo, the victim, when at 50 years old, the high, powerful man is able to exercise some autonomy over his mate choices. He shouldn't have that power. So it truly is a pathological form of diabolical power grabbing. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. And it's even worse than that, because even at the moment when the woman has the most power and doesn't, complain about it or recognize any kind of asymmetry, she's also complaining about it at the same time, because she's complaining that she's being objectified and she's being sexually harassed. And remember that video about the woman walking through New York City, and it was edited down to, she had a camera in her backpack or something, and it was edited down to 4 minutes to prove how horrible it was to be a woman walking through New York City. And I'm sure, out of the 18 hours of filming or whatever it was, the filmmaker decided to choose what seemed to be the most predatory and threatening 4 minutes. But even most of that was guys saying, hi, honey, hi, beautiful, in a perfectly, how are you doing today? I mean, most of it was really strikingly benign and nothing that any sane person would turn into some kind of project of victimhood. But it's just like the refusal of empathy for the experience of men, the utter lack of interest in imagining the male self, while at the same time the total demand that men think of nothing but the woman's perspective
So,
is really astounding.
so 2 points. First, a little quip. The entire country of Italy would cease to exist if that clip were, a form of street violence, because you don't want to walk around in Italy where, now, of course, nobody is suggesting that you ever be physically violent, that you harass, that you intimidate, but the whole art of seduction that endless women find incredibly sexually attractive would become, so Italy is no longer allowed to exist. We no longer want, and of course I'm being stereotypical, it's not just in Italy. There are many countries where men are a lot more bold in their pursuit of women. By the way, I've received many emails from women who say, dear Dr. Saad, my name is so-and-so, I'm from Sweden. Can you point me to where there's any longer any Swedish men that I can meet? Because nobody will come up and talk to me. Right.
Yeah.
So really, you're putting men in an impossible position. I wanted to say something else, but I forgot for a second. It'll maybe come back to me. Janice,
I'm trying to hide from the sun.
Oh, it's blocking. I wanted to say something else. I can't remember what it was. But anyways, can you tell us about any projects that you're currently working on that you'd like to use this opportunity to promote before we wrap it up? Although, of course, I could keep you for another 5 hours on here.
I know. Well, thank you so much. That was a great talk, and I really enjoyed it. And so all I would really promote would be, as I said, my producer, Steve Brule, and I are just starting up again after we received our permanent ban. But we're back on YouTube, which we've received a lot of criticism about, but that's where we are right now. It's called Studio B. It's very difficult to find right now. If anybody's interested in following us there, if they find me on Twitter, I came back to Twitter after going off for many months. So if you find me there under Janice Fiamengo, I have the link to the new YouTube channel. And so I'd be really grateful for anybody to follow us there.
It's the same format. You sort of do like a 20, 30-minute presentation, really well thought out, articulated, once a week or something, the way you used to do in the past?
Basically, we're going to do a little bit different in that we're going to have some longer documentary type, very carefully thought out of like 20 to 30 minutes. We're also going to have some shorter where I'm just going to be talking to the camera, giving an overview and a link to a longer essay. So, because some people like to read things rather than just listen to them. So we're going to do a combination of those types of things. But yeah, that's what we're planning. It's going to be very similar. It's called the Fiamengo File 2.0.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sad that you've left academia because you were one of my Canadian compadres with Jordan Peterson. We've lost a warrior, at least within the academic ecosystem, but it's wonderful that you're continuing your outreach in other venues. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Janice. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Stay on the line so I could say goodbye to you offline.
Okay. Well, I want to say online that I really appreciate you too, and thank you for your very kind words and for having me on your show.
Thank you, Janice. Cheers.